So recently Death Battle just dropped Perfect Cell vs Metal Sonic, and needless to say, this was very expected for Dragon Ball to lose because that's the most common trope that Death Battle loves to appeal to, having Dragon Ball characters losing. A little while ago, I predicted that this Death Battle would suck because they never give us the respect we deserve as Dragon Ball fans when we actually present facts and evidence. However, one position that Death Battle did get correct was that Cell was faster than Metal Sonic, but not for the right reasons. So for this video, I have two goals. One, it's to prove that Death Battle was wrong and that Metal Sonic has no win conditions to beat Cell, and to give clarity to my previous video because a lot of the people in the comments did not understand any of my arguments whatsoever. And to those people, if you disagree with my takes on Dragon Ball or just any take regarding power scaling, please come debate me. I've already said multiple times that my Discord server is in my bio. I am not reading your comments. Just go debate me directly if you disagree. You're just wasting your time and not getting a single response. For this video, I'm going to be collabing with my boy Trick, as it's a pleasure to have him on the channel. We'll be in charge of dividing this video into two sections, one of them being the Cell scale and the other one being refuting every single Metal Sonic win con to ever exist. Let's go to Perfect Cell. On to you, Trick.
So firstly, Frieza blatantly scales to Universal as way back in the Namek saga. It's stated multiple times that just in his second form, he's able to destroy the entirety of the living universe, as well as his existence being an active threat to it. And no, this isn't in reference of him just wanting to conquer it, because Frieza now has the power to destroy the universe, which implies that in his first form he couldn't, and between transformations it's his physical power that's changing, not his military power. If it was his second form that gave him the ability to conquer it, he'd always be in it. But prior to the Namek saga, that's obviously not the case, as in non-combat situations he's always in his first form. This is also not an overtime feat, as the language that's being used is that he wields enough power to destroy the universe, meaning that in his second form, he carries sufficient dormant power to annihilate the universe, and that isn't something he needs to recuperate his strength for. We can take this even further, as in his final form, the narrator states that his battle power is now of a different dimension, which contextually speaking would be higher dimensional, as if it was just some alternate dimension, the narrator would be asserting that his power is coming from somewhere else, even though that's his own dormant power. As for Cell, reaching his perfect form puts him at a tier of power that's completely immeasurable in comparison to the Z-Fighters prior to the 10 Days of Peace. This is corroborated by the fact that Trunks, who at this point in time is way stronger than Goku on Namek, can't even do as much as make Cell budge. It's even stated that Perfect Cell had reached a battle power of infinity, which is consistent as Toriyama himself confirmed that after the events of the Namek saga, characters reach battle powers that are no longer numerically measurable, making it consistent that Perfect Cell had reached a battle power of literal infinity. Knowing that final form Frieza with the finite battle power was 4D, Cell, who's infinite in comparison to that, would have infinite 4D or multiversal plus attack potency. You could possibly take this even further, as final form Frieza shows that finite increases in power level can make your attack potency increase in entire dimensions, and an infinite power level which is equal to an infinite amount of finite jumps to entail infinite dimensional attack potency. But for the sake of the argument, we'll just presuppose that he's only multiversal plus attack potency wise. As for speed, it's pretty simple. Cell having at least infinite power would mean he has infinite speed due to the attack potency speed correlation in Dragon Ball. We also know that Ki lets the user transcend their physical limitations, and it's used to amplify both speed and strength, so a being with infinite Ki output would be able to amplify their speed infinitely. And for Cell's abilities, he has all of the Z-Fighters techniques, Piccolo's regeneration, Frieza and King Cold's potential, and grows a great amount near death like Saiyans. And he even gains the abilities of his opponents if pushed near death, as seen with Cell learning instant transmission from self-destruction. So in conclusion, Perfect Cell has all of this, with multiversal plus attack potency and infinite speed at a bare minimum, with higher end interpretations getting him all the way to high hyperversal.
Thanks to Death Battle, the scaling for Perfect Cell is not limited to a single continuity, as they use the movies, etc., etc. Meaning whether or not you believe or don't believe these series are connected to the main timeline of Dragon Ball, it doesn't matter. Which means I can use Cell from Dragon Ball GT, and you know how this goes. In Dragon Ball GT, Cell is able to scale to base GT Goku, as he was able to temporarily absorb it. This is important because GT Goku destroyed the Sugoroku space in his base form with a Kamehameha, the same Sugoroku space which is stated to have no time or space. This is backed up by the narrator consistently, and is backed up by the fact that one of the death gods who has authority over the space points out how Goku would be trapped forever. In order for this to be possible, it must be the case that Goku cannot physically age, which requires time. If he could physically age, that must mean that he would eventually die of age, which would mean he wouldn't be trapped there forever. And having no time or space would also mean lacking the restrictions of time and space, which is outerversal by definition, as even infinite dimensional constructs necessarily need to have the restrictions of time and space, which which includes spatial extension and temporal duration. Even more consistency backing that the Sugoroku space is outerversal is that it's described as a similar example to the quote-unquote subspace category, which is described as lacking the concepts of time and space, and is separate from every area, which is inclusive of spatial dimensionality. So using Dragon Ball content outside of the main manga continuity is not looking good because it just gives Cell outerversal attack potency with irrelevant speed, which is something Metal Sonic cannot hope to ever achieve. Now let's debunk some of the counter arguments proposed against the scaling presented in this video. People try to argue that Cell stated he would destroy the solar system and not the universe, so therefore Cell is not universal. But this argument fails because hyping up X does not mean Y is false. This also ignores literally every other scan we have of Cell being universal, so this ultimately shadow boxes and attacks nothing. They then try to use the argument that he says now he has the power to destroy the solar system, meaning he didn't have the power prior. But the issue is that this is a mistranslation. The actual raw Japanese text never suggests anything about Cell not being universal prior to his Kamehameha. And even if it did, this literally attacks nothing, because the statement only exists within the manga continuity of Dragon Ball and not the anime. So it's still logically available for anime Cell to be universal and manga Cell to be solar system level. There's no problem with this. People would also try to argue that GT Goku doesn't scale to the Sugoroku space because the Sugoroku space was allegedly quote-unquote destroying itself. But this argument doesn't work because GT Goku can significantly affect the space, or at least be able to contribute to its effects, so therefore he would scale to it, whether it did or didn't destroy itself. They'll also try to argue that lacking the concepts of time and space and transcending the concepts of time and space are distinct, but there's literally no symmetry breaker, because if you lack the concepts of time and space while existing simultaneously, then you wouldn't be subject to those restrictions, so therefore you would be outerversal. I've also been seeing people try to use Majin Buu to debunk Cell being universal, but the issue is that Majin Buu is also universal. Now here's the funny part with Cell scaling that I think a lot of people ignore, because if Imperfect Cell is stronger than Namek Saga Frieza at full power, who is already universal, then that would mean that Semi-Perfect Cell and Perfect Cell and Super Perfect Cell would be astronomic amps on top of universal. So even if you scaled Metal Sonic to universal at the bare minimum, Cell would still be stronger because of these astronomic amps. So in conclusion, I have Perfect Cell at universal to outerversal in terms of attack power and MFTL plus to irrelevant speed. Now how does Metal Sonic hold up against this? Well, yeah, it's not fair. He doesn't match any of this. Now let's dive into every single counter argument that we can provide against every single Metal Sonic argument in his favor. The main argument is that Metal Sonic can just copy Cell's DNA or his biodata and he would win via this ability. This argument doesn't logically follow because Metal Sonic is not a living being, and to even have ki in the first place, you must be a living organism. And you also must be able to copy a spiritual metaphysical energy on top of this requirement. Now let's go over Metal Sonic's actual copying ability and what it is. What Metal Sonic does is that he copies one's biodata, which is essentially one's biology, and he does it in the way of mimicking abilities. For example, a chameleon can camouflage, so if I'm Metal Sonic, that means that I have the ability to camouflage using this ability. However, we must understand that there is a distinction between biological abilities and actual biology. Metal Sonic cannot literally copy your biology one-to-one, especially when we consider that he's an artificial robot, so he's not a living being, meaning he cannot literally have biology. It's the same way a plane can fly just like birds can, but it's not an actual living being, it's just a vehicle. It is basically just copying abilities that are intrinsic to one's biology, but not the biology itself. And even if Metal Sonic could copy ki, it wouldn't be the same quality as Cell's ki. You would need to prove that. And if it was identical to Cell's ki, this is literally a win-con for Cell, because in Dragon Ball, if you do not train yourself to handle a specific quality of ki, you will literally explode, which is exactly what happened when Moro tried to copy Ultra Instinct. He quite literally could not contain this ki. People will try to argue that Metal Sonic can copy ki because he can copy abilities that require chaos energy, but this argument sucks because it presupposes that ki is the equivalent of chaos energy. And no, I'm not allowing verse equalization. Literally anyone can just deny verse equalization and this argument wouldn't even follow. By the way, this argument is literally self-defeating, because if Metal Sonic can utilize chaos energy, it means that chaos energy does not necessarily require you to be a living being, which makes it distinct from ki. It could also mean that chaos energy is intrinsically linked to biology as well. And speaking of, ki is not intrinsically linked to biology. It is a spiritual energy distinct from the body to amplify one's physical strength and other stats. I've also seen people try to justify the androids being able to use quote-unquote ki key, so therefore Metal Sonic could use key or some sort of key-like thing. But no, because this presupposes that the androids and Metal Sonic function under the same artificial mechanics, which they need to justify. Unlike Metal Sonic, it's already verified by the series that the androids have an energy type that is literally akin to key 1-to-1. We can't just baselessly assume that Metal Sonic can do the exact same thing just because the androids can. You actually need to justify that intrinsic to Sonic's franchise and not to Dragon Ball, because one doesn't justify the other. So I think I've made myself pretty clear throughout this video that Metal Sonic cannot copy Perfect Cell. So now let's get into the other scaling that people want to argue for Metal Sonic and why it fails. People try to argue that Metal is above Solaris, and Solaris is a superdimensional being, so therefore Metal Sonic has superdimensional power. Superdimensional power is higher dimensional, so therefore Metal Sonic would be somewhere around the lines of these multiversal, low complex multiversal ranges of power. But this argument fails because it severely ignores context. Solaris is a superdimensional being, yes. However, Sonic does not scale to the superdimensional essence of Solaris. This is because the story contextualizes that Solaris had been dimensionally anchored or maintained, meaning he's not actually superdimensional, but rather that his existence is now maintained or limited to 3D reality. We know this is talking about dimensionality because a higher dimensional being cannot exist or operate within a lower dimensional 3D reality, because they are infinitely more complex spatially with higher degrees of freedom than that said reality, making them inaccessible. And the place Solaris and Sonic are fighting in is a three-dimensional reality because it's basically just a time-space nexus of the universe. So now that we know that Sonic wasn't even fighting the 5D or 4D Solaris, we also need to understand that he doesn't even scale to the anchored version of Solaris. This is because it's contextualized within the story that Super Sonic cannot take on Solaris on his own, and that physical attacks cannot work on him. So yes, this clearly verifies that Sonic does not even scale to this version of Solaris. I've then seen people try to say that Infinite is stronger than Solaris because of this famous statement right here, but this argument is so bad because this could literally just be dismissed as promotional marketing hype for Sonic Forces and not to actually reflect a fact about the narrative. It could literally just be promotional exaggeration, which is something that advertisements are known to do. So Sonic fans, please stop using this garbage promotional argument. This even happens in Dragon Ball 2. There's even promotional statements of Goku and Gohan being the strongest father-son duo despite the fact that the Grand Priest and Whis exist. The next argument to scale Metal Sonic high is by trying to argue that Metal Sonic scales to the Arabian Nights, which have a bunch of universes or thousands of universes. But this claim is not backed up anywhere. In fact, it's the exact opposite because the Arabian Nights is just one world split into multiple and can be perceived from one another, meaning that these are not separate spacetimes and these are most certainly not infinite. So no, the Arabian Nights scaling is not anywhere near multiversal. I've also seen people try to back up that these are multiple universes because they have multiple stories or that they function off of different physics. But this doesn't logically follow because even our own world has plenty of non-fiction stories. That doesn't mean those stories operate under different spacetimes. This argument is so stupid. And the physics point also doesn't help their case because there are many planets contained within the universe that operate under different physics. For example, there is a difference between Earth and Jupiter's gravity being much different from each other. And both of these planets exist within the same space-time continuum. So no, distinction in physics does not equal spatio-temporal distinction. People try to argue that Metal Sonic scales to infinite and infinite created the null space, and the null space is a place that is stated to be separate from every dimension. This would be inclusive of spatial dimensionality, so therefore Metal Sonic is outerversal. This argument doesn't logically follow because it's pre-assuming the word dimension is directly tied to spatial dimensionality or every and all examples of something that could be accounted as a dimension. It can just mean that it's separate from every single universe or every single timeline. It does not have to be an index to spatial dimensionality. People try to prove the context is talking about spatial dimensionality because it uses the kanji jigen, but Japanese translations don't dismiss semantical ambiguity and they could use the word jigen to express a universe or just another timeline. So this literally attacks nothing. Speaking of translations, let's use Sonic fans' logic against them. Some people try to argue that superdimensional is equivalent to an outerversal transcendence because it translates to transcend dimensions, and to be outerversal you must transcend dimensions. Aside from the wild amount of assumptions for the words transcend and dimensions, the statement doesn't even prove this in any form because even something fifth dimensional can transcend a set of dimensions, but something fifth dimensional is not outerversal. But anyways, back to abusing their logic, we can apply this to Dragon Ball because Garlic Jr.'s dead zone is stated to be a super space as it uses the kanji Cho Kukan, and for their logic, Cho means to transcend, so it's literally transcending space, and transcending space is necessary for outerversal, so therefore Garlic Jr. is outerversal and Perfect Cell is stronger than Garlic Jr. You see how sucky this argument is? Yeah, don't use this. People try to argue that Time Eater scales to this place called white space and Metal Sonic is stronger than Time Eater, so therefore Metal Sonic is outerversal because white space lacks spatial and temporal dimensions. This is not true for many reasons. Shadow directly states that he can use chaos control, and to use chaos control means that you can stop time, and if there was no time, there would be nothing to stop, but there is something to stop if chaos control is available. It's also contextualized that when the story treats the phrase no time, they're not talking about literal atemporality, but rather the complete stoppage of time, meaning time still exists. Going back to null space, people try to argue that null space is infinite because Sonic stated that it seemed to have no end, but for this argument to work, you would literally have to argue that Sonic has the ability to perceive infinity, which is never justified anywhere. Also, something appearing to have no end does not mean it has no end. And more proof that this statement would not be reliable is that the Phantom Ruby is directly stated to be an illusion-based ability, meaning that characters who are subject to the Phantom Ruby are also subject to illusions. And almost every null space statement comes from a character that is subject to the Phantom Ruby, which ironically enough provides us a strong basis to question every statement to be true. Also, the fact that the null space is a direct byproduct of the Phantom Ruby may or may not suggest that the null space never existed to begin with. People try to use Ian Flynn to prove that Solaris destroyed the concepts of time and space as a way to get him to Outerversal, but this argument logically fails badly because Ian Flynn, by his own admission, admitted that the concept of time and space, according to his own interpretation, is fourth dimensional.
Entire concept of time as the fourth dimension.
And not only that, this also goes against other views because he views Infinite as weaker than Solaris and the End.
Infinite is not even in their league. Discussed this before. When you get down to Solaris is probably the most powerful, but the End's pretty high ranked up there. Second place.
People also try to use the Egg Wizard, who is stated to allegedly transcend dimensions, as a way to get him to higher dimensional in power, but transcendence doesn't necessarily have to mean a higher spatial axis. It could just be talking about crossing between dimensions or a superiority in spatial position. There are many, many ways to interpret transcending dimensions. Now that I've debunked basically a bunch of these Metal Sonic arguments, let's also go into his speed scaling. People claim that Metal Sonic has immeasurable speed because of these really odd translations people have sent me relating to Sonic CD about his ability to travel through time. Even if I do grant that he can time travel through these translations, time traveling is not a measurable speed because it's still applicable to the speed formula. It's just distance divided by time, but you're applying time with negative numbers, and these can actually give you valid equations from the speed formula. And if your speed is applicable to the speed formula, then that means your speed is measurable. I've also seen people try to argue that Metal Sonic can move through stop time, so therefore Metal Sonic has infinite to immeasurable speed, but this argument also doesn't logically follow, because it can be the case that he can move through stop time as a means of a hacks ability as opposed to something accounting for his actual speed. For example, in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Dio can stop time, and he can move within this stop time, but he is not a measurable speed. It is just a hacks ability that is granted by his stand in order to move in stop time. We know this doesn't account for his speed because we're blatantly told that the World and Star Platinum both operate under finite measurements of speed. So given this, it does not have to be a narrative account for a measurable speed. Okay, we're finally at the end. After all of that, I think I finally managed to get rid of all of the major Metal Sonic arguments. If there's anything regarding Archie, I already covered in my Archie Sonic video. After finally engaging with every single Metal Sonic argument, I think I've made myself very clear, and Trick has made himself pretty clear, that Perfect Cell would absolutely destroy Metal Sonic with no difficulty. Anyways, that's all I got for this video. I hope Sonic fans can actually see the perspective that people on the negative positions hold and actually acknowledge how to make an argument, because this is not it and this was never it in the first place. Hopefully Sonic fans can actually see alternative perspectives from people who question or deny the scaling that they present and actually provide to others with a decently preserved argument. Coming soon will also be some pretty big videos. See ya.